Imagine you are a hunter in the deep woods of the American Northeast. The year is 1670. You are moving through a dense thicket of oak and pine, your eyes searching for the movement of a deer or the track of a bear. The world around you is familiar. It is the land of your ancestors. You know every plant, every insect, and every shadow. But then, you hear something new. A sound that has never existed in this part of the world before. A low, rhythmic thrum. A hum that seems to make the very air vibrate. You follow the sound to a hollowed-out elm tree. You look up and see a swirling cloud of tiny, golden-brown specks. They are furious. They are busy. And they have tiny, razor-sharp spears attached to their backsides. You have never seen a creature like this. It is not a wasp you recognize. It is not a fly. But as you watch these little invaders, a chilling thought enters your mind. These are not just bugs. These are messengers. These are the advance guard of an empire. You return to your village and you tell the elders a phrase that will echo through the next 200 years of history. The British fly has arrived. The white man is not far behind. When we think of the colonization of the Americas, we usually think of the big things. We think of heavy wooden ships like the Mayflower. We think of men in polished steel armor carrying long muskets. We think of gold and treaties and massive wooden forts. But what if I told you that some of the most successful conquerors of the New World did not carry guns or flags? What if the real shock troops of European expansion were only half an inch long and weighed less than a gram? This is the story of how the honeybee, a creature that literally did not exist in the Western Hemisphere before 1622, managed to outrun, outwork, and outlast the human settlers who brought them here. This is the story of a biological invasion so successful that we forgot it even happened. We now consider honeybees as American as apple pie. But the truth is, both the bees and the apples were illegal aliens who took over the continent and never looked back. Let us jump back in time for a moment to the pre-Columbian Americas. It was a massive, diverse, and stunningly beautiful landscape. But it was a landscape without honey. Think about that for a second. If you lived in Virginia, or Ohio, or California 500 years ago, you had never tasted a spoonful of golden, sticky honey. You had never used beeswax to waterproof your gear or light a candle. Now, the Americas did have bees, of course. There are thousands of species of native bees. But they are mostly solitary. They do not live in giant social hives. They do not store massive amounts of honey. There were no honeybees. None. There were no peaches, no pears, no watermelons, and no apples. Most of the iconic fruits we associate with American agriculture were waiting on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, locked away in Europe and Asia. The shift happened in January of 1622. A ship set sail from London, bound for the struggling colony of Jamestown, Virginia. Tucked away in the hold of that ship, along with the salt pork and the barrels of beer, were several heavy wooden boxes. These boxes were buzzing. They were the first hives of Apis mellifera, the European honeybee. The Virginia Company, the business group behind the colony, had a problem. Their settlers were starving and failing to turn a profit. They needed a way to produce their own sugar and wax. They needed the bees. But they did not realize that they weren't just bringing a livestock animal. They were releasing a biological storm. Now, here is where the story gets a bit weird. Usually, when you move a farm animal to a new place, like a cow or a pig, they tend to stay near the farm. Cows are not known for their strategic movements or their ability to organize long-distance migrations. But bees are different. As soon as those first hives were cracked open in the humid air of Virginia, some of the bees did exactly what the settlers wanted. They stayed put and made honey. But others were explorers. Every time a new queen was born, she would take a swarm of thousands of workers and fly off into the unknown. They headed west. They headed into the deep, dark forests where no European had ever stepped, and they moved fast. Much faster than the people. The historical record is absolutely wild on this point. While the settlers were still struggling to survive the winter and fighting over patches of land on the coast, the bees were colonizing the interior of the continent at a rate of several miles per year. By the time the pioneers began moving across the Appalachian Mountains, they were shocked to find that the honeybees were already there. It was like reaching the top of a remote, unexplored mountain and finding a Starbucks already open and serving lattes. In 1682, barely 60 years after the first bee arrived, swarms were seen in the deep forests of Pennsylvania. By the 1700s, they were in the Ohio Valley. They were always at least 100 or 200 miles ahead of the actual human settlement line. The native inhabitants of the land, the indigenous peoples, were the first to notice this. They didn't have a word for honeybee because the creature was alien to them, so they invented names. Some called them the British fly. Others called them the Englishman's fly. They watched the bees with a sense of growing dread. They realized that the appearance of a bee swarm was a mathematical certainty, that white men with axes and plows would follow within a generation. There is a famous passage by the writer Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur, a Frenchman living in America in the 1700s. He described how the Native Americans would point at the bees and say, "Sadly, that the white man's fly was here, and soon the white man's house would be here too." The bee was the ultimate spoiler alert. It was the trailer for a movie that nobody in the woods wanted to see. But why were the bees so successful? Why didn't they just die out in the harsh American winters or get eaten by local predators? Well, it turns out that the American landscape was a honeybee's version of a buffet. The massive, ancient forests were full of hollow trees perfect for nesting. The meadows were bursting with wild flowers that had never seen such an efficient pollinator. And the local bears? Well, the bears certainly loved the honey, but they couldn't stop the sheer scale of the bees' expansion. But the story isn't just about honey. It is about a total ecological restructuring. You see, the European settlers didn't just bring bees. They brought their favorite snacks. They brought apple seeds, peach pits, and pear saplings. But these trees have a very specific requirement. They need honeybees to produce fruit. Native American insects were great at pollinating Native American plants, but they weren't always a great match for the European invaders. Without the British fly, the legendary orchards of the American East would have been a massive failure. Imagine Georgia without peaches. Imagine Washington State without apples. Imagine a summer without a cold, juicy slice of watermelon. None of that would exist without the stowaways from 1622. In a strange way, the honeybees were building the world that would eventually sustain the settlers. They were the engineers of the new American landscape. They spread the pollen of European crops, allowing them to take root and flourish. They created the food supply that would eventually support millions of newcomers. It was a partnership of three: the human, the tree, and the bee. The human brought the seed, the bee brought the life, and the tree provided the profit. It was the first true global supply chain, and it was powered by a set of wings that beat 200 times per second. There's a bit of a suspenseful irony here too. We today are deeply worried about the disappearance of honeybees. We talk about colony collapse disorder. We talk about the threat to our food security if the bees vanish, and we are right to be worried. But we often forget that for the first 200 years of American history, the honeybee was viewed as a relentless, unstoppable invading force. To a native plant or a native solitary bee, the arrival of the European honeybee was like the arrival of a high-speed rail system in a quiet village. It changed the rules of the game overnight. The honeybee was a competitor. It was bigger, more organized, and it worked in massive teams. It literally outcompeted the locals for the nectar of the forest. By the early 1800s, the bees reached the Mississippi River. When the Lewis and Clark expedition headed west in 1804 to map the newly purchased Louisiana Territory, they weren't just looking for water routes and grizzly bears. They were keeping an eye out for the bees. Thomas Jefferson himself was fascinated by them. He believed that the progress of the bees across the continent was a way to measure the inevitable growth of the young United States. He saw them as a symbol of industry and manifest destiny. If the bees could survive the wilderness, then the American Republic could too. And the bees just kept going. They crossed the Great Plains, which was no easy feat since there weren't many trees to live in. But they found their way along the riverbanks, hopping from one stand of cottonwoods to the next. They made it to the Rocky Mountains. And then, in 1853, someone finally decided to give them a lift the rest of the way. A man named Christopher Shelton took a few hives of bees on a ship, sailed down to the Isthmus of Panama, carried the boxes across the jungle by hand, and then sailed up the coast to San Jose, California. Just like that, the invasion was complete. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, the British fly had conquered the continent. But let's look at the humor in this for a second. We have this image of the brave pioneer, the man in the buckskin jacket with his rifle over his shoulder, carving a home out of the savage wilderness. We celebrate his grit and his determination, but the whole time he was hiking through the woods, he was probably being followed by a swarm of tiny insects that had already done all the hard work. The pioneer gets to the clearing, builds his cabin, and finds a hive already full of honey nearby. He thinks, "Wow, I'm a master of the wild." No, you're not, buddy. You're just moving into a neighborhood that was already gentrified by a bunch of bees from London. The bees were the real scouts. They were the ones who checked if the climate was okay, if the flowers were good, and if the water was clean. The humans just followed the buzz. There is a dark side to this success story, though. When an invasive species is this successful, it usually means something else is losing. While the honeybee was making life easier for European farmers, it was making life much harder for the native bees of the Americas. Before the honeybee arrived, there were thousands of species of stingless bees, bumblebees, and masonry bees that did the work of pollination. They didn't produce giant pots of honey, but they were perfectly adapted to the local environment. When the honeybee arrived with its massive hives of 50,000 workers, it was like a massive supermarket moving into a town full of small, independent shops. The native bees couldn't keep up. They were pushed out. We are only now beginning to understand the full extent of the ecological damage that this beautiful, golden insect caused as it swept across the map. This brings us to a really uncomfortable realization. Our modern world is built on the back of this invasion. If we could go back in time and stop that ship in 1622, if we could throw those wooden hives into the cold Atlantic and prevent the British fly from ever reaching Jamestown, the United States of America would look nothing like it does today. Our agriculture would be based on native plants like sunflowers and squash and wild berries. Our forests would be different. Our diet would be different. The very identity of the American landscape is a construct of an accidental biological experiment. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other silent invaders are currently working right under our noses? We talk about globalization today as if it is a new thing, a product of the internet and jet engines. But the honeybee reminds us that the world has been mixing and matching its biology for centuries. The British fly was the original hacker of the ecosystem. It didn't ask for permission. It didn't sign a treaty. It just saw an opportunity, grew its numbers, and took over. Today, when you see a honeybee on a clover flower in your backyard, you probably think it looks peaceful. It looks like a symbol of the health of the earth, and in many ways it is. But if you listen closely to that hum, you can still hear the echoes of 1622. You can hear the sound of an omen that once terrified a continent. You can hear the sound of the vanguard that paved the way for the world we live in. The honeybee wasn't just a guest at the table of history. It was the one who set the table, cooked the meal, and made sure there were apples for dessert. So here is a little bit of advice. Next time you are out in the woods and you find a hive of wild honeybees, take a second to look at them. Don't just see a producer of sweet things. See a survivor. See a colonizer. See a tiny winged conqueror that did what the Roman Empire couldn't do. It took over a whole new world without ever losing its cool. And maybe, just maybe, give them a little nod of respect, because they were here first. They saw the wilderness before we did. They moved west before Lewis and Clark were even born. They are the true masters of the American landscape, and we are all just living in the world they pollinated for us. And if you're a hunter in the woods and you see a bee, remember the old prophecy. Look behind you, because the humans are probably not far behind. History doesn't just happen in the books. Sometimes it happens in the air, between the flowers, in a silent golden blur that we call the British fly. It is a story of luck, biology, and the sheer power of a tiny insect that knew how to work together. And in the end, maybe that is the real lesson of the honeybee. You don't need a crown to be a king. You just need a queen, a few thousand friends, and the courage to fly into the unknown before anyone else. The Americas weren't just discovered by men with telescopes. They were conquered by a bug that was just looking for a decent place to park its honey. And that, more than any war or any gold rush, is what truly shaped the world we see when we look out the window. Just a silent, buzzing disaster that turned out to be the most delicious accident in history.